first, we're going to begin in a good way, as we like to do in North America. And we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. All right, so let's proceed. Actually, before I talk about the context, I should just say that I'll speak first, and then Ashley will speak, and there'll be time, we hope, for some questions at the end. So I'm going to zip pretty fast through some of these slides, but you will get the slides, a revised version of the slides after the talk. So LEMDO is effectively a digital publisher. LEMDO sets the encoding protocols and has created and manages the platform that produces our digital editions, but the anthologies manage their own editorial workflows. LEMDO can help with project management if anthology leads need that, and they also frequently jump in to help editors with technical issues. As you can see, we're actually supporting 10 anthologies right now, and we're about to add an 11th, but Digital Renaissance Editions is our flagship anthology. And so a lot of what I'm speaking about today is coming out of the DRE editorial guidelines that Sarah, Brett, and James have written with a little bit of help from me, but mostly them. So by the end of today, you will know what an edition is and does. You'll know the general structure of a LEMDO edition. You'll have the 2 key questions that you need to keep in mind as you work on your edition. You'll know how peer review works for LEMDO anthologies, and you'll know how we finish and publish your edition. You'll also be able to start your preliminary work for an edition, and you'll be able to write your proposal. If you have questions, I think it's often best to take them right in the moment when you have them. So please feel free to ask questions as we go by putting up your hand or typing in the chat or just interrupting. Section header slides are blue. That's a good point to ask questions. So I'll just pause there and see if you have any questions. And then there's also the Q&A at the end if you need time to formulate questions. So first, what is an edition? This is the DRE definition of an edition. I believe this part's written by Sarah. So Sarah, if there are questions, I'm going to defer to Sarah here. So an edition is an information-rich scholarly project. I've highlighted the information part because, there's a lot of information that you're going to be pulling together, collating, accumulating in order to make an edition. And that edition guides readers towards a particular understanding of a literary work through the curation of contextual material. And we'll unpack, I won't unpack all of that, but you'll be getting the first copy of the DRE editorial guidelines that we're able to circulate, the first 2 sections where that definition is unpacked. What that means is that all the components of the edition together have to make a coherent argument about the play. And I know when I started editing, I felt like I had to do it all at once, everything, everywhere, all at once. It is true that you need to think about all the components of the edition early on, and that's why we have you write a proposal, or one of the many reasons we have you write a proposal. But the workflow of the edition does actually break down quite nicely into the component parts. And I'm going to talk about them in the order that you will likely be doing them so that you can get a sense of the workflow that you need to adopt to get your edition done. And so this section on the structure of the edition also serves as a bit of a workflow. So let's run through the parts. The main part, the first part of a digital edition is facsimile images of the authoritative witness that you're choosing to work from. LEMDO has a pretty good relationship with lots of libraries, so we can sometimes help you get facsimile images. Increasingly, libraries are making their facsimile images freely available, which is really helpful to us. Second part is the semi-diplomatic transcription of that authoritative witness. That will end up serving as the base text for your modern edition. The third part is the collation of early variants and early texts, and also editorial interventions that have been made over time. The fourth part is the modern spelling text with a list of characters. The fifth part is annotations. We will have a workshop on annotations at some point during the year. The next part is the textual introduction. After that, critical paratext, things like the critical introduction, the performance history, critical reception, and so on. And then finally, the bibliography for your edition, which you will actually be compiling and curating all along. So there has been a tendency in the past for digital editions to be quite full, and we are here to tell you that it does not have to be like that. So if you are looking at the old Internet Shakespeare Editions website or the old Digital Renaissance Editions website, you'll see that the editions are quite large. It's very rich. There's been this tendency to maximalism in digital editions because we could host all kinds of things without having to worry about page counts. So you'll see there's quite a bit in this edition, but I'm going to cross out the things that we no longer require. So you see that we've brought down the requirements for an edition by about half. You could come back later and add these pieces if you wanted to, but we really want to get people to get all the basics done first, get the edition across the finish line, and then the edition remains open because it's digital for you or other people to add other things later if you want. So the key questions to guide you, and these questions are eloquently written by Sarah in the Digital Renaissance Edition's editorial guidelines. What am I editing towards? Every critical edition is trying to reconstruct someone's intention, whether it is an author's, a scribe's, a company's, a publisher's, a patron's, an editor's, or someone else's, and that editor can include you. And it's important to have an answer to that question early on because that's going to affect your choice of base text. I shouldn't have put copy text there. The way you modernize, what you collate, and how you contextualize the text. The second important question is, for whom am I editing this text? Students, scholars, theater practitioners, machines. We could, in theory, take the text that we've prepared for LEMDO and output them as plain text files, and somebody could use them in computational analysis, but that's not actually the primary purpose of a LEMDO edition. DRE editions are designed for the use of students, scholars, and theater practitioners because they are first and foremost accessible teaching editions for classroom use. All DRE editions feature modernized spelling and punctuation with commentaries designed to elucidate and explain unfamiliar terms, historical and cultural references, and in the case of drama, performance histories. Right, so those are the groups that we're focusing on: students, scholars, and theater practitioners. Why do you need to think about your reader right away? Because the answer affects what and how you will annotate and what kinds of information you will provide in your information-rich project. So,
Janelle, could I jump right in here for just a second?
Please.
Can you go to the previous slide for a moment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the reason, so this seems on the one hand fairly straightforward and almost so obvious that perhaps it doesn't need to be said. But one of the things that has often occurred in digital editions is a more is more approach, this especially in the early theorization of digital projects. Let's put it all in because it will be great. Somebody might be able to use it. But that thesis fundamentally works against some of the principles of textual theory, which Fredson Bowers articulated, which suggests, what is this for? And so before you, as you are working through what you might want to put in your edition, when you think about what is this for, you also need to think about who is this for? Because you have a finite amount of time to spend with this project. And if you want your project to be for everyone, your project is never going to end. So binding yourself in a nutshell is one way to help ensure that your project gets across the finish line, but it's also a way of ensuring that you recognize that your project can't be all things to all future people. You want to leave some meat on the bone for other scholars to do something else potentially. So decide what you can do and what you can do well. And I think that that is sort of a key starting point that is particularly useful. As a general textual editor, often one of the things that we're doing is trying to ask questions to get editors of texts to make their projects a little bit more straightforward than expansive. Very, very rarely are we doing the reverse. So that's something to think about as you begin your projects.
Thank you, Sarah. You might want to jump in here again too. There are instructions on how to write a proposal in the DRE editorial guidelines, and those instructions will likely work well for other anthologies. These are some things that you can be thinking about right away. What are the significant texts of your play? Are you dealing with a one-text play or a multi-text play? It's good to know how many early publications there are. You can check Greg. You can also check the database of early English playbooks, which corrects a lot of errors in Greg. Go Zach and Alan, and ask yourself where the copies are. So if it's a Shakespeare play or a Marlowe play, you can check the Shakespeare census or the Marlowe census. We're hoping the ESTC will come back online eventually so we can find out where the other copies are. Why do you need to do that? Because your first task is to prepare, or at least to check, a semi-diplomatic transcription of a witness. Also, what are the significant textual issues? You can start reading up on that right away. Skim the textual scholarship, look at past editions, if any, read their textual essays. If you're working on a Shakespeare play, that's going to be a formidable task. If you're working on Civitatis Amor, that is not going to be a formidable task. Mahila actually read everything there is to read in a year. I'll skip over the why to save time, but you'll have that later. What are the significant previous editions? Brett Greatley Hirsch, one of the co-applicants on the grant that's funding us, has a list of every edition ever produced of anything since 1709. We're spinning that out into a resource called the Bibliography of Editions of Early English Drama. He will send you back a list of every edition in about 5 minutes. If you're dealing with Shakespeare and key canonical authors, you can't possibly look at all the editions, so you'll have to make a judicious selection. If you're dealing with a non-canonical play, it's very likely that you'll be able to deal with all editions, and it's possible that there might not even be an edition ever, and yours is the first. What are the key critical issues? So for the purposes of the proposal, skim articles, monographs, or reviews of monographs, book chapters, skim the critical introductions in other editions, and make sure that you're aware of what the key issues are before you start to write your proposal. Things that can wait until you're actually into the work are deep reading of the criticism and textual scholarship, performance histories, source studies, and bonus materials for readers, chronologies and images, for example. Okay, pause for questions. Okay, let's move on. So the semi-diplomatic transcription, if you were working in the old ISE, old DRE days, you'll know these as old spelling texts. We've shifted the terminology for various reasons. There are 3 different ways that you can prepare a semi-diplomatic transcription. In a lot of cases, the LEMDO team has already corrected a semi-diplomatic transcription. That's what Rylin's been working on. We inherited transcriptions, so we've just done the work of re-encoding them and checking them. If your play is in EBO TCP and we don't have a transcription of it already, we can take the transcription out of EBO TCP. We can run an XSLT transformation on it and give you a text that conforms to baseline LEMDO encoding, and then you would need to correct it. You can also transcribe a witness, which you would have to do in the case of manuscript plays. Time management. If you're proofing, I would budget 2 to 3 full days for that, and you do need to put out a timeline in your proposal, so it's good to get a sense of how long things take. I would say at least a week for correcting a TCP transcription, and at least 3 full-time weeks if you're doing the full transcription yourself. If it's a manuscript, it will probably take quite a bit longer. Pause for questions. Okay, establishing the text. So we'll take that semi-diplomatic transcription as the starting point for the modern text. Again, we will run an XSLT transformation, and we will give you a file that has the semi-diplomatic text still in it, with the bibliographic tagging stripped away and the modern tagging in place. So that will save you some time. And here you have a workflow choice. Some people like to collate first and not modernize that semi-diplomatic transcription. The advantages of doing it that way is that you get to take stock of textual and editorial history before you make your own decisions. The downside is that you might be influenced by other people. You can choose to modernize first. The plus of that is that you are not influenced by other people. The downside is that it then becomes a bit harder to do your collation because you might have forgotten what was there in the first place. I would budget at least 4 full weeks for doing that work of modernizing. Collation is a much bigger process. As you're modernizing, you're probably going to be thinking about the text quite a bit. So there's 3 things you can do. You can actually start an annotation file and put your textual notes in it while you're collating. You could leave comments in the file about things you want to gloss or comment on later. And you can start making notes for a textual introduction. I think the key principle is that if you're thinking it, record it somewhere so that you don't lose that thought. Questions?
I have one.
Yes.
I'm curious. I have an intern working with you this summer, and I'm delighted. I'm just wondering what she'll be doing. So, where I know she'll be working on Love Labor's Lost, but will she be starting the TEI or?
That's probably a side conversation for you and me to have
Okay.
so that we can set up your students' time effectively.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay, contextualizing your play. The relevant parts of the edition that do the work of contextualization, in addition to collations, are annotations and critical paratext. We have webinars on those things coming up, so I won't say anything right now. The bibliography is the last part. You will have been keeping a bibliography all along, but you need to get serious about the bibliography before you start working in earnest on your critical paratext, because you'll be citing things from your bibliography. We'll have a webinar specifically on the bibliography, so more about that in a few months. There's some big workflow decisions that you have to make. Annotations should point to critical paratexts, and critical paratexts should point to each other and then back to the modernized text that you've created. So you might want to write your annotations and your critical paratext simultaneously, or again, leave notes to yourself so that you remember to make links later, following the same principle. If you think it, write it down so that you don't lose that thought. For critical paratext, there are 2 models that we have seen in LEMDO editions. Model 1 works well for texts that have a long critical and performance history. So you might choose to break down your critical paratext into a general introduction, critical survey essay, which focuses on what people have said about the play over the last 100, 200 years, textual introduction, and a performance survey. Model 2, you could write a general introduction and fold the critical survey and the performance history into the general introduction. You would still want to have a separate textual introduction, however. One thing to keep in mind. Yes, Sarah.
Janelle, could I just separate out for a second what distinguishes a textual introduction from another kind of textual introduction? Excuse me. The textual introduction or the textual essay is explaining the provenance of the document that becomes your base text. So where did this thing that an author wrote come from? That's what's being articulated in your textual introduction. So though we can sometimes play fast and loose with the word text in other contexts, particularly in our own literary critical writing, that is emphatically not what is meant under the LEMDO guidelines. When we're talking about a textual introduction, we are specifically talking about the history of a document from an author through scribal publication, through a theater company's house, through a printing house, through editions, etc. So I just want to emphasize that in case there was some question.
Yep. Thank you, Sarah. Time budget, depending on the richness of the editorial and critical history of the play, the length of the play, I would budget 6 full months to write a general introduction and critical survey. Some people say I'm going to do it this summer and, you know, hunker down and do nothing but that for the summer. It should take 4 full months to write annotations and 4 full months to write a performance history for a play that has a rich performance history. A lot of our plays at LEMDO don't have a rich performance history, so there's almost nothing to write, and you can lessen the budget for that in your proposal. Of course, everybody's doing lots of things, so expand that timeline in your proposal to make sure that you can also do your teaching, other research, service work, parenting, whatever else is on your plate. Oh, thanks, Heidi. WSB is on the cusp of resumption. Hooray! All right, let me talk just really quickly about peer review. There are some peer review options that LEMDO can support, but ultimately it's up to your anthology leads, however they want to do this. We can support incremental peer review and publication. So a logical point to stop and send stuff out for peer review is when you have the modern text collation and textual essay done. They form a kind of a unit and they can be peer reviewed together, and then have the annotations and critical paratexts reviewed together as a second step. The holistic way of peer reviewing, I think I got my slides mixed up a bit here. Anyway, I'll sort that out later before I send them out again. The holistic way to do it would be to review the whole edition at once. And what we do for peer review is we actually put the edition in what we call the peer review anthology. And we can give that link to the peer reviewers so that they can look at your edition in a frozen state. You might still be working on it on the development site, but the peer reviewer is going to see something stable. We can also use the peer review site for students who have to defend a thesis or be examined on their project. Last one I went through for an anthology, it took about 3 months, for just over 3 months actually, for a review of the edition run by the anthology lead. And the LEMDO team also reviews the encoding. And then the editor turned around revisions really quickly. It was about 6 weeks. So that would be between you and your anthology lead. LEMDO will roll with whatever is the decision of the anthology. For encoding, we will talk a lot about encoding this year. The technical webinars are all about encoding, but there are some options. You can do your own encoding and work in the LEMDO repository right from the outset. Navarra will be talking in our second webinar about how you get set up to work in the repository. LEMDO will review your encoding for validity. The content review will fall mainly to the anthology lead. The second option is that LEMDO encodes your edition, and usually if that's the case, we need some financial support to pay Rylan and Mihaela and Navarra, but that is an option for you if you do not want to do your own encoding. if you proceed that way, we will inevitably check and correct and query your content. The process of encoding is like a very high level copy editing, and we will catch things and we will work with you to make your edition as good as it can be. Publication. While you're waiting for peer review, you can write those final pieces that a published edition needs. You can write acknowledgements, you can secure image permissions, you can prepare any bonus materials, chronologies, plot summaries, pedagogical notes. That would be between you and your anthology lead, but that's a good time to do it. After you are given feedback and made your revisions, we'll be asking you to proofread your digital edition. We'll be asking you to proofread the print edition if your anthology is working with us to prepare a print edition of your play. You will enter your final corrections in XML if you're comfortable. It's a lot faster for everybody if you learn a little bit of XML and can do your own corrections at the final stage. And then you'll work with the LEMDO team to finalize the metadata and license your edition for publication. Okay, I'll just tell you what resources we're sending you, and then I'm going to hand over to Ashley before we go on to Q&A. We launched the LEMDO beta website yesterday. Thank you, Navarra, for masses of work over the last few weeks. And the beta website, we're not announcing with great fanfare that it's now available. We want to keep working on it and getting feedback from you before we do a big splashy launch. But if you go to this URL, which we'll include in the package of materials we send to you, and you click on the documentation tab, you will see a 23 chapter book on encoding. So that's coming. That's already available. We'll send you these slides with speaking notes. This has been recorded, and we'll post it to YouTube with captions when it's ready. We'll be sending you an excerpt from the DRE editorial guidelines. We have a sample DRE proposal, which we can send upon request. It's absolutely hilarious, so everybody should read it just for laughs. Sarah and Brett are responsible for that. They made a proposal for a play that doesn't exist. And your anthology leads are also a really crucial resource for you. Okay, so just thank you to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council for funding this webinar. Navarra did the slide design. Thank you. Martin Holmes is our lead developer and wrote the TEI customization. And the Humanities Computing and Media Center is responsible for site design and hosting. So I'm going to hand over to Ashley.
So one way that students can find a way into editing is going to be through a thesis. So I'm going to kind of outline a beginning path into what Janelle has just laid out for us. If we go to the next slide. I just want to begin first by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to talk today. Yeah, so I will share some of my experiences in editing for my master's thesis and walk through some of the key details that you might find useful when starting this kind of edition, or for our group today for leading your students through that kind of edition. I hope that you'll come away with a sense of the benefits of completing a thesis edition, how you can tailor an edition to suit your specific needs, and how the thesis can prepare you to submit a proposal for a full-length edition if that's something you want to do. So a bit of background: in 2020, I finished my master's at UVic under the supervision of Janelle Jenstad and Erin Kelly at UVic. With their help, I completed a thesis edition of Ralph Nevitt's Rhodon and Iris, which is an occasional play. It was written for a society of gentlemen florists, which those existed. And it was performed at their feast in Norwich. It was likely performed only once, and its anniversary was actually just last week on Friday, May 3rd. So this was an incredibly enjoyable and interesting project, but it was also a bit of an experiment, and it gave us a sense of how you might want to carry out a successful thesis edition in the future. So if we go to the next, yeah. I first wanted to show you this image, and it shows, forgive my use of old spelling text, that was habit. It should be semi-diplomatic text. But it shows the progression of that text from the 1631 facsimile. My text was the Boston Public Library copy. The middle is that same page in TEI markup. And the last is, of course, how that would be rendered on the LEMDO website. So it's all the same page. But I've included this to give you a glimpse of the work and the output, so what you and your students can look forward to. But it also is a reminder to me of why we need editors to work on high quality editions. Because every time I look at this page, I remember the fact that the EBO TCP transcription, the very first word of dialogue in the play, they actually get it kind of wrong. So that block letter, they transcribe as a T, but it's actually an I. And that's a small error, like it's not a big deal, but it does kind of demonstrate to me why we need reliable transcriptions that are informed by critical practice. You know, it's not as simple as saying, you know, just write down what's on the page, because that in itself is a question, like, what is on the page? I love that it's the first word too. So the next bit is about the thesis. So kind of when you're in the thick of it, building your project. And maybe the big question to start with for students is why bother, you know? What can someone gain from doing a thesis edition, and how is that different from a traditional essay project? First and foremost, you'll learn about editorial theory and how to edit. That's incredibly obvious. While I wrote that, I felt a bit silly, but I put it that way for a purpose because I was surprised by the sort of unexpected skills, experiences that fit under this like very large umbrella of editing. And a few that stood out to me was that first, I came to really appreciate the critical editions that I was working with and how those texts actually got to me as a student. You know, the original playbook isn't necessarily superior somehow, or the text that we should be using only. It also introduced me to many of the tools that early modernists use on a regular basis, like the ESTC, moment of silence, and deep. And it also made me think more critically about the materiality of these books, which might sound a bit paradoxical when you're working with digital texts, but things like under-inked letters, torn pages, marginalia, those all posed editorial questions. And I think it would be really unique if your students were able to edit a play that's actually housed at your institution. That would bring a whole other level of materiality, quite literally. On the more technical side, students can learn TEI and practice encoding in a very structured way, and learning how to use the tools for doing that, like Oxygen XML editor. Those are things that can be transferred into a career after the degree. And students have a chance to make an original research contribution, especially if you work within the LEMDO framework. And that can lead into a peer-reviewed publication, which isn't always possible with a traditional essay. Yeah, and then the last thing, I was surprised by the network of editors, programmers, and other experts that I was able to meet and work with. And I found that people were especially knowledgeable and very generous with their time. So it felt to me like a really great way for students and early career researchers to sort of expand their knowledge. It was very supportive. Yeah. Okay, so you've decided to do an edition, but how do you set yourself up for success as a student doing your thesis? The first question or first step, as with most things, is to decide how much time you have. Yeah. Um, it took me about 6 months to finish the transcription and encoding of my semi-diplomatic text while I was doing coursework. And that also will include sort of the preliminary work of finding your text, researching the copies, the editions. That's all kind of what I've lumped together in that first category there. So 1 or 2 terms is a good amount of time to complete those items and prepare your old spelling text. And your institution might require an essay to accompany this work. So UVic did. And a textual essay can serve that purpose as a way for students to show that research, and then maybe in a modified version for the thesis to reflect on their editorial choices. And this in itself is excellent. I would highly recommend it as a place to start. If you have more time, you might want to add the modern spelling text with markup. And the last category there is kind of just something to consider. You probably won't have this kind of time, more than a year, to spend on a thesis, unless you're maybe working toward a PhD. This might also apply if you have a very, very short text as well. But this is what I did, and my degree ended up taking 3 years, which was lovely and very enjoyable, but too long. So it might also show what could fall outside your scope. And yeah, so what do I mean by scope? Deciding which parts of the edition to include, how granular your work will be. For Rhodon, we decided that collations and a performance essay just weren't crucial for the thesis. But, you know, we're often guilty of feeling overly ambitious at the start of the project, so that the feeling of everything everywhere, I was so reluctant to cut anything. They were all my like dear children. I wouldn't give up any of it until I realized this is actually like a lot of work. Yeah, and so the biggest difference between a thesis and a full edition is that the thesis does need to meet the requirements of the degree first and foremost. And yeah, so limit the scope to match your degree, and then you can always change the plan as you go. For choosing the text, some pointers, go for something short. Occasional drama is fun and interesting, and very different from the commercial Shakespeare-y texts that a lot of students will be familiar with, and it gives them a chance to explore other genres. A play with few texts is ideal. So Rhodon was printed only in quarto. It does have a variant title page. So there's a Q1 and a Q1A. But the only difference was the name of the bookseller in Norwich. So yeah, and I also just want to emphasize that just because these plays haven't been edited before, it doesn't mean they're bad plays. They just haven't received attention yet. So after the thesis, You're a master, now what? You can choose to submit a proposal to the LEMDO anthology. And completing the thesis before doing this has some very good advantages. You can write a very authoritative and strong proposal. Like, it's very rare that you get to write a proposal for a project you've pretty much done. And if you've designed the edition with an eye toward LEMDO, then it'll already follow the guidelines and principles. So the transition will be much smoother in that way. And then just one more note, during the thesis, the assessment and guidance will have come from the supervisor and committee. But once the proposal is submitted and approved, then the LEMDO anthologies can become involved in the edition. And then you can go through the peer review processes that Janelle was talking about. At which point the student becomes a full-fledged editor. So for me, looking back, I mean, my proposal was accepted, and now I'm working on Rhodon and Iris during my PhD, which has been great because it's also very flexible and the timelines are very forgiving. So if you can work toward one piece, then that feels very manageable. But looking back, I just wanted to say that my editorial experience has really helped me across all of my work, not just in preparing this edition, but it made me a better reader of early modern plays and also, I would say, a more careful researcher. And editorial work in general has built some of my most meaningful connections in academia, which I think is something people don't talk about as much as it should be. So it's very rewarding work and done in a supportive network. So I would say that a thesis edition is a great way for students to investigate neglected plays and find what interests them. And then from there, they can make their own scholarly interventions. Yeah, and that's kind of run through quickly of it, but also my thank yous here. Same as Janelle, to Shirk for funding the webinar series, Navera for all of your wonderful help and for the template and always being there for questions. Martin for everything that he does, and HCMC for the site design and hosting, and also for everything that they did when I was a research assistant at UVic as well.
Thank you, Ashley. It's so great to hear your perspective on the editorial process. We have about 6 minutes for questions, so let's open up the floor.
Janelle answered a question from Heidi that was asking, after the student completes a thesis edition, but before it's added to LEMDO, where does it live? Can it be accessed? And Janelle has answered that it lives on the LEMDO dev site, and that we can put it in those LEMDO classroom or peer review anthologies if it's needed for teaching. So for those of you, if you don't mind me jumping in just to specify what LEMDO dev is, for those of you who aren't familiar with LEMDO, we do have our published websites. We also have a development site for things that are in process, but not yet added to an anthology and published. So that's available for editors and encoders. It's not accessible to the public. We don't share the link around, but if it is needed to be taught, it can go on one of those published and public sites, the peer review or the classroom.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about the classroom site. I have put unfinished editions into the classroom site and taught from them as a form of early peer review. You know, student feedback on an edition is absolutely fantastic as part of the editorial process. And the questions they ask will guide you in finishing annotations, for example, because you're actually running the play past the very audience that it's designed for. But I'd prefer that you not cite those. You're certainly welcome to go have a look at them. and admire their work, but they're not quite ready for the limelight yet. David Swain adds a comment about doing an early table reading of Jack Juggler with novice Renaissance students, and their experience has guided me in thinking about modernization. Thank you, David. Any other questions? Any other questions?
Janelle or others, I guess I'm curious about, I mean, rest in peace, ESTC, but are suggestions for sort of ESTC equivalents at the moment in terms of looking for sort of early editions, that kind of stuff, publication history?
You should be using the short title catalog by Pollard and Redgrave.
Yeah, okay.
There is the ESTC itself is insufficient for accuracy when it comes to in a comparison with Pollard and Redgrave.
Okay.
It is superior. There are errors in the ESTC. It's great for what it is for a digital, you know, and hopefully someday it will come back. But there is no question that the widely available short title catalog by Pollard and Redgrave in the 3 volumes is where you're going to get the most accurate information about publication history.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah.
There's also currently I'm looking at the website right now, an independent temporary search interface for the ESTC called Prints and Probability that is in existence. I'll put that in the chat as well.
That's Christopher Warren's. Christopher Warren and his team quickly spun up an ESTC. Yeah, now, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Shakespeare Census Project and its spin-off projects arose precisely because the English short title catalog is not accurate in its identification of editions.
That is correct. The reason that those projects exist is to correct the errors of the ESTC. So it's not that the ESTC is not useful. It's useful, but you need to treat it like a starting point, not as an authoritative, bibliographically accurate system. It can get you to discovery, but it cannot get you to make quantitative or comprehensive claims. The same is true of the USTC, the Universal Short Title Catalog by Andrew Pettigrew, which is helpful if you are trying to figure out continental editions of things. It's again a great starting point, but you don't use it to make comparisons. You use it to springboard the existence of stuff.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a question in the chat from Sebastian. Is there a way to export for print publications? Yes, we have a LaTeX publishing process that takes our underlying XML and turns it into camera-ready copy. At the moment, we can make that camera-ready copy available through the University of Victoria e-publishing office. Put a beautiful cover on it, get an ISBN number, cataloging and publishing page. Sebastian's question, I believe, speaks to the possibility of publishing it with a different publisher. I'm totally open to that. We would need a contract with the publisher so that we had a clear understanding that we would be publishing an open access digital edition at the same time that they're publishing a print edition. I think that's a great option for our editors. If we can work with an external publisher, then we get the best of both worlds, an open access educational resource and something that people can hold in their hands. And we should be able to keep the print edition and the online edition in line because we're actually generating the camera-ready copy from our underlying XML. If in that process you see mistakes in the print edition, we will also correct them in the XML and then regenerate the print copy. Navarro's put in the chat some information about our forthcoming print titles, and there's a little bit of information there about the process by which we take things from XML to print. A question from Kristen. We're past the 9 o'clock mark, so if you need to leave, please feel free to leave. Thank you for being here. I'll stay and take some questions for a bit before we wrap up. Kristen, you had a question.
I was wondering if, as we're proofing our not copy text, something else, sorry, lots of cold medicine. should we be assigning through line numbers at that point in time? I'm thinking about our, you know, as we're taking notes for annotations and everything else moving forward, what would you suggest would be a good practice for that?
Navarra is smiling. Do you want to take that?
I'm excited about this question. When you're working on a semi-diplomatic transcription, you don't need to manually number lines yourself. Hooray! We have a editor tool in our Oxygen, in our LEMDO project, that you click a button and your lines get numbered. So if they're encoded correctly according to the LEMDO practice, it will get numbered. We typically do that at the end of a transcription, because when people are proofreading that, they often find that lines are in different places depending on what their, you know, text that they're transcribing from is versus what was on EBO TCP or the ISC or wherever your original transcription is coming from. But that is available, and typically that's done right at the end of your semi-diplomatic transcription. In the meantime, if you don't have those line numbers in, we also do number our speeches. And so if you're linking from, say, your annotation to a semi-diplomatic transcription or to your modernized text, you'll put a anchor element in that semi-diplomatic text or your modernized text, and then link to that, and we automatically, programmatically generate the speech number, the accent and speech number, which we're using in place of line numbers in many cases, because they're, you know, the same regardless of what people's screen size is. And hopefully
What
answers.
One more thing to answer that question, just in terms of structure, when it comes to Kristen, I think if I understood your question correctly, it's partially about how do you leave notes for your future self so that you can figure out that you wanted to add an annotation in one place or another before you necessarily have all of the speeches numbered or whatever. The answer is that the lemma is going to do that work for you. So you work with lemmas. Lemmas are full text searchable, right? You'll be able to figure out, you know, there's only so many uses of the word, I don't know, stone that you wanted to annotate in your text. You should be able to sort of find your way there. So just leave lemmas for yourself. And that will, in practical terms, make it a lot easier for you, rather than line numbers. Don't rely on line or scene numbers as much.
That makes great sense. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, I am on the screen. I'm advertising our next webinar, which will be run by Navarra, who is our go-to person for helping editors as they get set up in the repository. So if you're already set up in the repository and you need a refresher, please come out. It's efficient for us to train lots of people at once. If you want to know what you'd be likely to be getting into, please come out. And if you know you want to work in the repo coding and TEI right from the outset, you definitely need to come out. And you can get a credit towards the Canadian Certificate in Digital Humanities by attending that webinar. That's Laura Estel's project, particularly for RAs. I think it would be a great opportunity to start building credits towards a real credential. So,
I'll note
Navarra,
that I
last thoughts?
Yeah, I'll note that I also put a link that's disappeared up at the top of the chat, I think. I'll put it in again. All of our technical webinars that we have coming up over the next year do count as credits towards that. So if you go to that ccdhhn.ca website that's in the chat, search for LEMDO. You'll see all of our technical webinars. You can register for them now, and they'll be coming up over the next year.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for coming out. I hope to see you in 2 weeks for the next webinar.